Hey gamers, welcome to Video Games in the World. I am John. Today, in honor of the new Castlevania animated Netflix series, we will touch the history of the Castlevania franchise. This is one of my most favorite franchises in gaming and it has a special place in my heart. It is a dark fantasy themed action-adventure game series created by Konami, centered on the Belmont family, a clan of vampire hunters who fight against Dracula and his unholy legion. The first game released for the Famicom in Japan and NES in America was so successful and received critical acclaim and spawned a very popular franchise. All those years of vampire hunting and creature slaying. Each game had a new Belmont, and there were other games in which the Belmonts were not the main protagonists. Most games were side-scrolling platformers, while others still had the side-scrolling, but rather than stages, it had exploration with RPG elements such as EXP. Castlevania was so popular, and it still has the spotlight up until this day. Let us begin our journey into the world of Castlevania. Enjoy! The Castlevania series was heavily inspired by books and old films about supernatural creatures, such as vampires, werewolves, Medusa, mummies, the Grim Reaper, and even the Frankenstein monster himself. The vampire genre was popularized by the Bram Stoker novel, Dracula. Mary Shelley was the creator of the Frankenstein novel. As for werewolves, the genre of shape-shifting man-woman creature was popularized by the 1930s movie, The Wolfman, and even other movies in the late 20th century such as An American Werewolf in London and its sequel, An American Werewolf in Paris. Since those days, vampires, werewolves, zombies, and various mythical creatures were a part of pop culture and was very much loved by lovers of these stories. And this is where Castlevania comes in. The common elements of the game were borrowed from such creatures, and the original game mentioned parody names modeled after famous people associated with the horror genre such as Bram Stoker, a satirical name of the original author of Dracula, Bram Stoker. In the original game, there were other famous names that were satirized such as Christopher Lee, Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff, Barbara Shelley, and Lon Chaney. Christopher Lee and Bela Lugosi at one point played as Dracula. Boris Karloff portrayed the Frankenstein monster and also the mummy. Barbara Shelley was in various Dracula movies, and Lon Chaney Jr. portrayed the famous Wolfman for the 1941 movie, The Wolfman. Unfortunately, there was no name that satirized Peter Cushing, who in many Dracula movies played as Abraham Van Helsing, before he was Governor Tarkin in Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. And now, onto the story of the series. The story of every game in the series was always about the Belmonts, a family of vampire hunters who fought against powerful creatures and demons before defeating their arch-enemy, Dracula. According to the lore, every century, Dracula is resurrected from the grave, and a Belmont rises up to fight against the vampire lord and his minions. Rather than Abraham Van Helsing helping Jonathan Harker defeat Dracula, it's the Belmont family who fights against him for centuries. The main weapon of the Belmonts is their legendary ancestral whip known as the Vampire Killer. In the games, there were extra projectile sub-weapons available such as axes, knives, cross, stopwatch, and the holy water. In Rondo of Blood and Symphony of the Night, Richter would use the Holy Bible as a weapon. In Dracula's Curse, Ifabelnades would use fire, ice, or lightning as her sub-weapons. However, in Rondo of Blood, Maria Renard would use animals as her weapons such as a bird, a cat, an egg, a music book, a turtle, and a dragon. Usually, fans' favorite sub-weapons would be either the cross or the holy water. However, in other games, the Belmonts were not the main protagonists, but at one point are mentioned. In Circle of the Moon, the main protagonist is called Nathan Graves, who wields a whip similar to the vampire killer called the Hunter's Whip, much to the jealousy of Hugh Baldwin, son of his master, Morris. In Bloodlines, the main characters are Quincy Morris and Eric Lecarde. Eric Lecarde uses a lance, and Quincy Morris uses a whip, and is said to be a distant descendant of the Belmonts, and it is also one of the characters in the Dracula novel by Bram Stoker. And finally, in Aria and Dawn of Sorrow, the main hero is Soma Cruz. However, after beating the game with Soma, gamers have the chance to play as Julius Belmont. The story of its origin is shown in Castlevania Lament of Innocence, where its prototype form is created by Rinaldo Gandolfi for Leon Belmont through the use of alchemy. This whip is later fused with the soul of Leon's betrothed, Sarah Trantoul, giving birth to the vampire killer. Games that were not canonical to the main story of Castlevania were Legends, Circle of the Moon, Legacy of Darkness, and Castlevania 64. Nevertheless, they were still successful and popular. Lords of Shadow served as a reboot of the franchise, and features Gabriel Belmont on a quest to defeat the titular Lords of Shadow. While it does indeed feature the usual Castlevania motifs of vampires, werewolves, and the undead, the plot is set before the rise of Dracula himself. The first Castlevania game was first released on the NES in 1986 by Konami. It is a platforming game where players take control of Simon Belmont, a descendant of the Belmont family who uses his ancestral whip, the Vampire Killer, against many creatures and foes before defeating his arch-enemy, Count Dracula himself. He travels to the demonic castle, Castlevania, and fights his way through the castle, destroying Dracula himself and the castle. Secondary weapons in Castlevania are powered by hearts, collected by attacking candles and killing monsters, which is like ammunition in a certain way. The secondary weapons are the daggers, the holy water, the flying axe, the stopwatch, and the cross. Hidden items such as power-ups and food, health replenishment items are also found by attacking walls within the levels, a feature inspired by Nintendo's Super Mario Bros. With countless hidden items across the game's levels. However, the stopwatch costs 5 hearts, thus using hearts up rather quickly. But the good thing about it is that it freezes enemies for a short time, and also players can take advantage of it by getting through tougher areas. Vampire Killer, released in 1986 for MSX Computer, took a departure from the traditional platform gameplay of Castlevania, instead introducing an open-ended form of gameplay. The game's non-linear design had a similar structure to the Metroid game released that same year. The sequel to the original game was Simon's Quest, released 30 years ago. Unlike its predecessor, this had a non-linear gameplay and more open-ended world than that of Vampire Killer and Metroid, with several exclusive elements such as world map that was free for players to explore and visit. Simon can talk to townspeople who will offer him clues or lies. He starts with a standard leather whip, which can be upgraded by a merchant with each new purchase. This game also introduced an EXP system, which is increased by collecting hearts. Experience systems are typically in RPG games like Final Fantasy, Lufia, and so on, and some people compared this game to Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. The period of time in Simon's Quest cycles between day and night, which has a prominent effect on the game's and Simon's encounters. During the day, enemies outside of towns in the game are weaker, but at night, it's a contrary, and they inflict more damage to Simon's life points. Though when defeated, they drop more hearts. The townspeople and merchants in their respective locations are no longer available to talk during the night, and are replaced by zombies and other creatures. Despite the departure from the previous game, there are elements that have remained. This includes magic weapons, which are secondary to Simon's whip. Each of them have a different use. Like most games in the series, some of these require the usage of hearts. One of them, returning from Castlevania, is the holy water, a small glass which can disintegrate walls that conceal hidden items. Some magic weapons make their first appearance in Simon's Quest, such as the diamond, which attacks enemies while bouncing off any surrounding walls. The objective of the game is to travel to the 5 mansions to find the body parts of Dracula's corpse and an item known as a magic cross. The body parts can be utilized to support Simon in the game. For example, Dracula's rib can be used as a shield to block any projectile attacks from any enemy. Finding all the required items will allow Simon to clear the blockade in front of Dracula's castle to fight the last boss. After the player defeats Dracula, there are 3 possible endings based on the time taken to complete the game. The best ending is achieved when the player beats a game in 8 game days or less. Simon's Quest, however, provoked some controversy upon its release, receiving strong publicity in the second issue of Nintendo Power. Its front page had a costume model dressed as Simon Belmont, holding Dracula's severed head. This cover angered many parents of children who purchased the magazine, stating that it gave their kids nightmares. Nintendo Power covered this in volume 50 of the magazine, which cited this as its worst cover. Simon's Quest gameplay elements will be used in future games such as Symphony of the Night, Circle of the Moon, Harmony of Dissonance, Aria and Dawn of Sorrow, and Portrait of Ruin. The third installment in the franchise, Castlevania III Dracula's Curse, was released in 1989, 28 years ago. The gameplay returns to its original platforming roots and introduced a new Belmont, Trevor. However, he was not the only character that was playable. The game introduced 3 new characters, Grand Dynasty, Sypha Belnades, and fan favorite Alucard. Grand Dynasty had the ability to climb onto walls and change direction in mid-jump. Sypha Belnades had poor physical attacks, but her magical powers packed a punch. Alucard, a half-human, half-vampire hybrid, had the abilities to shoot fireballs and transform into a bat. The player can spiritually transform between Trevor and his ally with a select button. Both Trevor and whoever is accompanying him share the same health meter. The ending of the game differs depending on which companion Trevor has with him at the time, or if he does not take a character with him at all. There are 2 main routes through the game's 16 stages. The second stage is an optional excursion for picking up one of the 3 partner characters, and the main branch occurs part way through the third stage. Each route contains a total of 9 stages, 10 if the player takes the optional second stage. The upper route takes the player across the lake to the main bridge, entering Dracula's castle through the front gate, and is generally regarded as the easier of the 2 routes. The lower route is harder and takes player through a series of underground tunnels and cavernous areas, eventually scaling the cliffside below the castle, and is generally considered more difficult than the upper route. The lower route also features one short branching section of its own at stage 6. The 2 paths converge in the main hall of the castle. After the third game's release, there were other titles for the Game Boy where Christopher Belmont is the main hero: Castlevania The Adventure and Belmont's Revenge. However, the adventure will be remade for the Wii Virtual Console as Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth. Castlevania Legends was also another title which featured the first female Belmont, Sonia. Unfortunately, Sonia was non-canon, much to the chagrin of many fans up until this day. Bloodlines was another successful title for the Sega Genesis, in which our heroes would travel the world fighting monsters, demons, and even Countess Bathory herself. According to history, Countess Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian countess known as the biggest mass murderer of her time. She had kidnapped, tortured, and killed over 600 young women, and bathed in their blood. Castlevania also had 2 Super NES titles that were very successful: Super Castlevania IV, which was a remake of the original game, and Dracula X, which was a Super NES port of the TurboGrafx-16 Castlevania game, Rondo of Blood, which would be remade for the PSP as the Dracula X Chronicles. Rondo of Blood tells a story of Richter Belmont in which he rescues Maria Renard, who becomes his sidekick, and rescues 3 other women, including his girlfriend Annette, who happens to be Maria's older sister. In Dracula X Chronicles, if Richter or Maria failed to rescue Annette, they would fight against her in the clock tower when she becomes a lesser vampire. The original Rondo of Blood featured anime sequences, and Richter also unleashed the true power of the sub-weapons, such as a Grand Cross for example. A major turning point in the gameplay mechanics of the series was Symphony of the Night, released 20 years ago for the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn in 1998. Expanding on the open-ended style of the gameplay previously used in Simon's Quest, Symphony of the Night style of gameplay has been termed Metroidvania due to its similarities with the non-linear and exploration-focused side-scrolling games of the Metroid franchise. It also used role-playing video game elements such as collectible weapons, armor, and hidden orbs. Many subsequent Castlevania games have since followed this template. Ayami Kojima's art was introduced in Symphony of the Night, and has been featured in a few other titles as well. Years later, the first two Castlevania games for the Nintendo DS returned to the anime style used in Rondo of Blood, among other titles in hopes of broadening the player demographic, but not discouraging slightly younger Nintendo DS owners to be put off by Kojima's art. Dawn of Sorrow was the first game to do this, and the second DS release of Portrait of Ruin followed with the same style. The first games in the series to employ 3D graphics were Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness for the Nintendo 64 in 1999. In 2003, the next 3D Castlevania title featured combat-oriented hack-and-slash gameplay that drew comparisons to Devil May Cry, the 2001 title, though Lament of Innocence introduced several unique features to set itself apart from Capcom's title. The game has also drawn comparisons to the 2002 release Rygar: The Legendary Adventure and the 2005 game God of War, both which use similar chain blade weapons, while the latter use also similarly flashy and smooth attacks that could change direction in the middle of a combo. In the late 1990s, the Sega Dreamcast became a major success, with games such as Sonic Adventure, Sword of the Berserk, Code Veronica, Shenmue, and many more. However, a Castlevania game was scheduled to be released on the Dreamcast which featured Sonia Belmont as the main hero. It was intended to be the 17th title of the Castlevania series for the short-lived Sega Dreamcast console. This would also be the third Castlevania game at the time to enter the 3D realm. The game was to focus on Sonia Belmont and a new character, Victor Belmont, a vampire hunter from the 1800s who had abandoned his lineage. The story is set in 1666, directly before Simon Belmont's adventure in the original Castlevania. Greg Orduyan, the art director for the game, is so far the only staff member on the project to speak of how it would have worked out. Its cancellation is credited to many things, including disagreements between the Japanese and American Konami teams, and also the death of the Dreamcast to the announcement of the Sony PlayStation 2. In my honest opinion, if this title was on the PlayStation 2, it would have been better, but that was Konami's decision, not ours. Castlevania was featured in other media as well. The main hero of the original Castlevania game, Simon Belmont, was one of the members of the N team in the hit 1980s cartoon series, Captain N, the Game Master. He still carries his traditional vampire killer whip, much like in the games. The N team defended the kingdom of Videoland from the attacks of the video game villain, Mother Brain and her allies, King Hippo, Eggplant Wizard, Dr. Wily, and Dracula, who in the cartoon was called the Count. In 2005, IDW Publishing released a comic book adaptation of Castlevania that was titled The Belmont Legacy. It was written by Mark Andreyko and art was by E.J. Su. It was based on Castlevania, The Adventure, in which the main character is Christopher Belmont. In 2008, a graphic novel adaptation of Curse of Darkness was released by Tokyopop in English, and the main character of Curse of Darkness is the same guy from Dracula's Curse, Trevor Belmont. In November 2005, Crystal Sky Pictures acquired the rights to create a live-action film based on the video game series. The original director and writer was Paul W.S. Anderson, known for his involvement in the Resident Evil series of movies, based on the series of video games. Production was slated to begin in mid-2006. Producer Jeremy Bolt stated in an interview that the movie will be an origin of Dracula and the Belmonts. Anderson stated that the lush, gothic, and romantic looks will be used in the movie as well. A year after its acquiring of the right to film the movie, Rogue Pictures replaced Dimension Films, who reneged over script differences in handling North American distribution of Castlevania, with Crystal Sky Pictures handling international distribution. Paul W. Anderson described Castlevania to take place in many time periods, but primarily in 15th century Transylvania. The director and producer Jeremy Bold had scouted locations in Hungary and Romania, with plans to build castle interiors in Budapest. Principal photography was slated to begin in spring 2007. In January 2007, director Anderson said that the studio was finalizing the film's budget and filming will begin in fall or winter in Transylvania and Hungary. According to the director, the filming was postponed because the production had desired snow on the ground for the film's forest scenes. Anderson described the locations. It was like discovering Mordor as a real location, epic, dramatic, and above all, scary. These locations haven't been shot properly in a mainstream movie, so that it's always extra exciting to put something on camera that hasn't been seen before. The director also revealed that post-production and effects work for Castlevania would be done in London. In June of that same year, Anderson conceded directing duties to Sylvain White in order to take on the project of Death Race, a remake of Death Race 2000. White, who played the Castlevania game in early 1990s, was attracted to the prospect of filming a vampire film. He explained, "Most of vampire films have been present or set in the future, from Blade to Underworld, and I was attracted by the chance to make a dark, epic period movie that almost has an anime feel to it." The new director, who negotiated a salary of 7 figures, will rewrite the script with Anderson's assistance. The premise will follow Trevor Belmont and his younger brother Christopher as they are ordered into service to the church to take the cursed castle of Dracula and live up to the legend set by their ancestor, Leon. The production was slated to begin in late fall 2007 in South Africa and Romania. Castlevania was planned for a late 2008 release. In October 2007, Anderson said that he had hoped to have a script within 2 or 3 weeks before the onset of the 2007 Writers Guild of America strike. Jeremy Bold said production was intended to begin in spring 2008. In December 2007, Rogue Pictures halted active development of Castlevania due to the writer's strike, and later, the sale of the studio to Relativity Media, and possibility of a Screen Actors Guild strike. Despite the shelving, White remains committed to direct the film. In May 27, 2009, the film was cancelled officially. However, on July 22, horror website Bloody Disgusting broke the news that Saw co-creator James Wan had been signed to pen a new draft, as well as to direct. A few months later, it was reported that Paul W. Anderson is still circling the project. 5 years ago, while promoting Resident Evil Retribution, Paul W. Anderson stated that he would like to make it. However, the rights are an issue, especially now with Konami going all pachinko on their titles. Despite the film's cancellation, a fan-made series titled Hymn of Blood is available on YouTube, created by Start. Actors from Star Trek The Next Generation, Michael Dorn and Marina Sirtis, are part of the cast in some episodes of the series. When people think about TV shows originally made by Netflix, what shows come into mind? House of Cards, Orange is the New Black, Daredevil, Jessica Jones, Luke Cage, Iron Fist, Fuller House, and many more. However, in 2015 there was a special announcement for Castlevania. The game series would have an animated series created by Frederator, produced by Adi Shankar, known for making the fan films Dirty Laundry and Power Slash Rangers, and also written by Warren Ellis as an original Netflix TV series. This miniseries will be based on Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse. There have been 2 seasons planned for this show. The first season, which will be released on July 7 of this year, while the next season will be released sometime next year. It has 4 parts with 30 minutes each. So if you have Netflix, then consider yourself lucky, especially if you're a fan of the series. And finally, to conclude this, despite not having any more games to play on console since Konami has put it on pachinko slots, I think that Castlevania remains an unforgettable video game series, which is a cool thing, and at least it has a spiritual successor, Bloodstained: Ritual in Moonlight. My personal favorite games of the Castlevania series are Super Castlevania 4, Rondo of Blood, Symphony of the Night, and Circle of the Moon. Aria and Dawn of Sorrow might be up my alley, as well as Harmony of Dissonance. However, games like Judgment and the mobile game I did not like. Castlevania holds a special place in gamers' hearts and memories, and it's still something worth playing. If you people have something to say about this historical episode of Castlevania, don't forget to comment, rate, share with everyone you know, and subscribe. And here's a preview of the Season 1 finale of Video Games and the World. So, the episode about violence in video games will be the Season 1 finale. In this episode, we will be debunking all kinds of negative themes aimed at video games for years since their creation. Because we all know that we gamers have survived these kinds of things. We have survived the media, politicians, religious groups, lawmakers, and struggling against the likes of feminist frequency and many other things. So, this is John, host of Video Games in the World. Have a good one. Bye-bye.